Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as the soldiers lifted her into the carriage. She was 16 years old. Court records would later call her Consort Han, one of the Korean tribute women sent into the Ming palace. But in that moment, she was just a daughter being handed over to the Emperor of China. Her mother stood nearby, weeping as she pressed an ink mark onto the document. She couldn't write her own name. One less daughter to feed, one less mouth during famine. The carriage door slammed shut. Han traveled for weeks in a sealed wagon with 15 other Korean girls. They weren't allowed to look outside. They weren't allowed to speak. When one girl tried to run, they brought her back with her hand crushed so badly the bones pierced through skin. She died of infection days later. They left her body on the roadside. No one tried again. Resistance, they understood, was not an option. When the gates of the Forbidden City closed behind Han, she realized something almost immediately. Serving the Son of Heaven had nothing to do with honor. She would spend 16 years inside those walls. She would watch an entire harem vanish in a single night. She would beg to see her mother one last time, and she would die wrapped in white silk. If you're new here, subscribe. And if you want us to keep uncovering stories like this, leave a like. Because what comes next is even darker. Han's story didn't begin with her carriage ride. It began centuries earlier, with a system designed to harvest young women the way farmers harvest crops. When people imagine Chinese imperial concubines, they picture elegance, embroidered silks, poetry, lantern-lit gardens, a life of luxury beside the most powerful man in Asia. That image is propaganda. The imperial concubine system lasted more than 2,000 years. During that time, tens of thousands of women disappeared behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. And here's what most people don't realize. Concubines were not wives. Under imperial law, they weren't even considered fully human. They were classified as possessions, valuable objects, compared in official records to porcelain vases. Every 3 years, officials traveled through the provinces in what they called the Shunu selection. It sounds refined. It wasn't. It wasn't an audition. It was a forced harvest. During the Ming Dynasty, no family was exempt. Every unmarried girl of eligible age had to be presented. Hiding a daughter was treason, punishable by death for the entire household. The candidates were inspected by eunuchs and palace physicians. Every inch of their bodies was examined. Birthmarks, scars, imperfections. Any flaw meant disqualification. Those who passed were taken. Families received a small payment. Refusing it meant admitting disloyalty to the emperor. Technically, the system didn't need to kidnap anyone. Poverty did the work. And once the girls were taken, most families never heard from them again. Letters were forbidden. Visits were impossible. In rare cases, if a concubine rose to high rank, her relatives might receive a stipend. But for the overwhelming majority, their daughters simply vanished behind the red walls. Some families even held funerals for daughters who were still alive, because they understood the truth. The girl they had raised was already gone. Han arrived in China under a slightly different arrangement. Korea sent women to the Ming Empire as diplomatic tribute. Between 1408 and 1435, more than 100 Korean women were delivered to the Forbidden City, not as guests, as property. The day Han crossed those palace gates, she stopped existing as a person. She became a number, an asset belonging to the Son of Heaven. But before she could serve, she had to be broken. The selected women didn't go straight into the harem. First came what the eunuchs called refinement. It could last 6 months. sometimes 2 years. The first stage was identity destruction. Their hair was cut, an act considered deeply dishonorable. Their names were replaced with numbers or generic titles. They were forbidden to mention their families. Saying the word mother could result in punishment. Any personal belongings from home were confiscated and burned. They slept in crowded barracks, 20 to a room. They woke before dawn and weren't allowed to sleep until after midnight. For months, they lived in a state of total exhaustion. When your body is that depleted, resistance stops being possible. Then came submission training. They learned dozens of ways to bow. They practiced 8 hours a day. If a bow was imperfect, bamboo rods struck their legs. Many carried those scars for the rest of their lives. They were trained to walk without making a sound, to keep their eyes lowered, to answer before being asked, to exist without taking up space, to smile when they wanted to scream. A Qing Dynasty training manual later listed 47 separate rules for how to stand in the emperor's presence. 47 ways to exist in a single moment. Breaking even one rule meant punishment. The final stage was preparation to serve the emperor. I won't describe it in graphic detail, but palace medical records speak in disturbingly clinical language about eliminating resistance. Monthly examinations, notes about candidates requiring multiple preparation sessions. Administrative documents recorded everything as if they were describing livestock. After months of this, the women who survived were declared ready to enter a world where their suffering had barely begun. Once training ended, they entered the official hierarchy, and this was another form of hell. At the top stood the empress, the emperor's only legal wife. Beneath her were the imperial consorts. Below them, high-ranking concubines divided into levels. And at the bottom, the common concubines, sometimes hundreds, along with preparation women whose fate was still undecided. Rank determined everything. The amount of food you received, the color of your clothing, the size of your room, the number of servants assigned to you, even the type of dishes you were allowed to eat from. The empress received more than 22 pounds of prime meat every day. A low-ranking concubine received barely 4, often less. Corrupt eunuchs routinely stole provisions before they ever reached the kitchens. Many lower-ranked women suffered from malnutrition. Their teeth loosened, their hair thinned. They aged decades within years. And here was the cruelest irony. The more their health declined, the less likely they were to be summoned by the emperor. It was a downward spiral built directly into the system. The emperor didn't visit concubines. They were summoned. Every night, a eunuch presented him with wooden tablets engraved with the names and portraits of available women. The emperor pointed. That was all it took. The chosen concubine was escorted to the bathing palace. Female eunuchs washed and prepared her, but they did not dress her afterward. Instead, they wrapped her in a silk blanket like a parcel, leaving only her face exposed. Why? Because clothing could conceal a weapon. 2 eunuchs carried her to the imperial chambers. They unrolled the blanket at the foot of the bed. The concubine, completely exposed, had to crawl toward the emperor without raising her eyes. And here's something almost no one talks about. A chief eunuch remained in the room the entire time, hidden behind a screen, but present. His job was to keep time. After exactly 30 minutes, he would call out loudly, "Time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven." The emperor had to end the encounter immediately. If he did not, the eunuch entered the room and physically removed the woman. Afterward, an imperial physician examined her and recorded every detail. If she became pregnant, There needed to be absolute proof the child was the emperor's. But here's what makes this system even more disturbing. Most concubines were never summoned, not once. There were hundreds of women in the harem, sometimes more than 1,000. The emperor might select 1 or 2 per week. Do the math. A concubine could spend her entire life waiting for a call that never came. She would age in silence, watching younger girls arrive, knowing that the only reason she had been taken from her family might never be fulfilled. And she still couldn't leave. She couldn't marry. She couldn't have children with anyone else. She was property in permanent storage, with nothing to do but wait. And when you trap hundreds of women in a closed world like that, stripped of identity, cut off from family, told that their only value lies in one man's attention, something inevitable happens. They turn on each other. The Imperial harem wasn't just a prison, it was an arena. Every woman understood the math. One pregnancy could change everything. It could elevate you, protect your family, secure your survival, or it could paint a target on your back. So a hidden war unfolded behind silk curtains and painted screens. Concubines poisoned one another's food. They bribed eunuchs to remove rivals' tablets from the emperor's nightly selection. They spread rumors designed to destroy reputations. There are documented cases of women slipping abortive herbs into a pregnant rival's tea. If the baby died, so did the mother's future. The logic was brutal, but consistent. Centuries earlier, the same dynamic had already shaped palace history. Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China in her own name, was later accused of strangling her own infant daughter and blaming a rival concubine. That rival was executed. Wu rose higher. Historians still debate whether it truly happened, but the fact that it was believable says everything about the culture inside the harem. Violence wasn't always physical. Psychological warfare was constant. Senior concubines humiliated juniors. Favorites were isolated, sabotaged, whispered about. Alliances formed over shared meals and shattered because of a single glance from the emperor during dinner. One Qing Dynasty account tells of a concubine who spent 3 years pretending to befriend a rival, sharing confidences, exchanging gifts, only to testify against her when the empress launched an investigation into disloyalty. The rival was demoted to servant status. Her children were taken from her. In this system, cruelty wasn't personal. It was survival. Women who had been kidnapped, trained, and dehumanized learned to do the same to others. Because if you didn't strike first, you were the one destroyed. And if a concubine somehow survived this invisible battlefield, if she caught the emperor's attention, if she became pregnant, that's when the nightmare truly began. You might think bearing the emperor's child would guarantee safety. In reality, it often made things worse. A low-ranking concubine who became pregnant was immediately isolated, moved to remote palaces deep inside the Forbidden City. For 9 months, she lived under constant surveillance. No visitors, no letters, no walks in the gardens. She was watched at all times. When the baby was born, it was taken away immediately. If it was a boy, he was handed over to wet nurses and raised far from his biological mother. She might see him once or twice a year, supervised by eunuchs, forbidden to touch him. If it was a girl, sometimes she simply disappeared. Imperial records rarely bothered to document the fate of daughters born to low-ranking concubines. There are accounts of women so desperate to avoid bringing a daughter into that system that they secretly consumed abortive herbs, risking their own lives rather than condemning a child to the same fate. And if a son died, the blame often fell on the mother. Negligence, bad karma, even murder. Smallpox, infections, common childhood illnesses, none of it mattered. A grieving mother could be demoted, exiled to an isolated wing of the palace, or permanently confined. One Qing dynasty concubine lost 3 children to smallpox. She was accused of bringing poisoned fate into the imperial bloodline. She spent the next 40 years locked in a single room, forbidden from seeing any other member of the imperial family. Her crime was burying her children. Her punishment was dying alone. But even this daily cruelty did not prepare the women of the Forbidden City for what happened in 1421. That year, Emperor Yongle had just completed construction of the Forbidden City. It was a symbol of absolute power, a statement to the world. And then a rumor spread. One of the emperor's favorite concubines was found dead. Officially, it was declared poisoning. Unofficially, whispers told a different story. They said she had taken her own life after an affair with a palace eunuch. They said the real reason was the emperor's impotence. Whether it was true didn't matter. What mattered was humiliation. Yongle was furious, paranoid. He ordered an investigation, but not to uncover truth. He wanted silence. In a single night, approximately 2,800 women connected to the harem were executed. Not just concubines, servants, cooks, laundresses, any woman who might have heard the rumor. The method was lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, designed to prolong suffering. Executioners were instructed not to be merciful. Some victims took hours to die. The screaming echoed through the palace complex until dawn. Girls as young as 12 were included. Women who had served for decades. Pregnant concubines. It made no difference. Anyone who might have known. Anyone who might have spoken. By morning, palace courtyards were washed with buckets of water drawn from the wells. The same wells where, in later centuries, many women would choose to end their own lives. Official Ming records never mention this massacre. It was erased, but one testimony survived. Lady Kui. She was a concubine who happened to be outside the palace that night, visiting a sick relative. By accident, she escaped the purge. Years later, she dictated her account to a Korean envoy. She described screams that lasted until sunrise, courtyards slick with blood, eunuchs dragging bodies through corridors she had walked every day. She named women she had eaten beside, girls she had trained with, friends who had shared her fears. Her testimony was preserved in Korean diplomatic archives, beyond the reach of Ming censors. It remains one of the only first-hand accounts of that night. Lady Kui's survival didn't last long. When Emperor Yongle died 3 years later, she was selected for accompanying sacrifice. Her final recorded words, preserved by that same envoy, "I survived the night of blood, only to die in silk." Han, the young Korean woman whose trembling hands had gripped that carriage, also survived the massacre. For a time. But survival inside the Forbidden City was never permanent. 3 years later, in 1424, Emperor Yongle died, and Han's name appeared on a list. During the Ming Dynasty, there was a practice called shunzang, accompanying sacrifice. When an emperor died, some of his concubines were buried with him, alive. The logic was horrifyingly simple. The Son of Heaven would need companionship in the afterlife. Who better than the women who had served him in life? 3 days after the emperor's death, eunuchs compiled a list, usually between 5 and 30 women. The chosen ones were given a final meal, rich delicacies, wine they had rarely been allowed to drink. In some accounts, musicians played as they ate, as if it were a celebration. Then came 2 possible endings. The first, voluntary hanging with white silk cords. This was considered an honorable death. The woman's family would receive compensation and official recognition. Some families encouraged their daughters to accept, believing it was better than the alternative. The second option, refusal. If a woman resisted, eunuchs would hang her by force, or drug her with opium until she lost consciousness. Their bodies, sometimes still faintly breathing, were placed seated inside chambers surrounding the emperor's tomb, arranged as if waiting, attending, serving, even in death. In 1958, archaeologists opened the tomb of Emperor Jingtai. Inside, they discovered the remains of 16 women placed in side chambers around the emperor's burial site. All of them were seated upright. Forensic analysis revealed clear signs of cervical trauma, consistent with hanging. But 3 of the skeletons told a different story. Fractured bones, scratch marks carved into the stone walls, fingers worn down from desperate attempts to claw their way out. They hadn't died cleanly. They had been buried alive, and they had tried to escape. The practice of shunzang was officially abolished in 1464. Not because anyone suddenly found compassion, but because too many powerful families were losing daughters, and political unrest was beginning to stir. Han wasn't that fortunate. She died in 1424, 30 years too early, before the abolition, before anyone decided the practice was inconvenient. When Emperor Yongle died, Han begged to return to Korea. Her mother was elderly. She asked permission to go home, to care for the woman who had pressed that trembling ink mark onto a document years earlier. The new emperor rejected her petition. Han was hanged with white silk. She was buried beside the man who had destroyed her life. She was 16 when she entered the Forbidden City. She was 32 when she died. 16 years inside those walls, and she never saw her mother again. But even after shunzang was abolished, life did not become merciful. It became something quieter, and in many ways, almost worse. Concubines who survived their emperors were no longer buried alive. Instead, they were sent to the Palace of Perpetual Solitude, remote, forgotten corners of the Forbidden City. The rules were simple. Never leave the complex. Never marry. Never contact the outside world. Perform manual labor. Pray for the dead emperor 3 times a day. For decades. They slept on thin mats laid across stone floors. Food was basic. Illnesses were treated only if they threatened to spread to others. Many lost their sanity. Others simply stopped eating, their bodies wasting away in silence. The most common method of escape became the wells in the Imperial gardens. During the 18th century, records suggest that an average of 12 bodies per year were pulled from those wells, removed at night. No ceremony, no documentation, just one less number to account for. The youngest recorded widow was 14. She had been married to an elderly emperor for 3 months before he died. She then spent 61 years confined to the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. 75 years old when she finally died. Her entire adult life spent mourning a man she barely knew. The concubine system officially ended in the early 20th century, but the last imperial consort didn't die until 1946. Her name was Wanrong, the final empress of China. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, she lived through political chaos, war, and imprisonment. She lost her children. She became addicted to opium. She died at 39, alone, buried in an unmarked mass grave. The system was gone, but its damage lingered. Today, more than 14 million tourists visit the Forbidden City every year. They walk through golden courtyards. They admire the sweeping yellow roofs. They take photographs in front of dragon-carved thrones. Tour guides speak of architectural brilliance, imperial ceremony, dynastic power. They rarely mention the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. They don't point to the wells where bodies were found year after year. They don't explain why certain buildings were sealed off and quietly used as storage rooms for decades. Officials have tried to soften the palace's haunted reputation without ever asking why that reputation existed in the first place. Because some walls still bear the faint marks of desperate hands. Han was 16 when she entered that carriage, 32 when she died in white silk. In those 16 years, she never heard her real name spoken with affection again. She never walked the fields of her homeland. She never embraced her mother. She was sold as tribute, trained as an object, used as a vessel, buried as an accessory, and she was only one of tens of thousands. Historians estimate that across 2,000 years of imperial China, more than 100,000 women passed through the concubine system. Most of their names were never recorded. Most of their stories were never written down. They exist now as ledger entries, as skeletal remains in tomb chambers, as ghosts in palaces tourists photograph for social media. Modern narratives often celebrate imperial achievements: gunpowder, the compass, monumental architecture. But rarely do they confront the human cost. The same civilization that engineered astonishing technological progress also perfected the industrialization of female suffering. That truth is uncomfortable, but silence doesn't honor the victims. Forgetting doesn't bring justice. The Forbidden City still stands, its red walls unbroken, its courtyards polished, its history curated. But stones remember, and now so do you. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments which part of Han's story affected you most. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe, because there are more buried truths waiting to come to light.